The silence of a fallen capital is never truly empty. It is heavy with the weight of what was ignored. Look at the cracked marble of the plaza, the moss creeping over the inscriptions of forgotten kings, and the way the wind whistles through empty archways. These structures were built with the arrogance of gods, designed to last until the end of time. Yet, they did not. In the shadows of these golden ages, voices emerged, seers, hermits, and chroniclers who spoke of fire, ruin, and the inevitable dissolution of power. They stood in the marketplaces and the corridors of influence, whispering warnings that the ruling classes dismissed as madness. We are here to investigate these figures who claim to witness the collapse of empires before the first stone fell. Why did they see what the masters of the world refused to acknowledge? And why, even now, do we remain haunted by their words? This is not a study of magic. It is a journey through the archives of civilizational dread. The dust is still settling, but the voices of the seers have never stopped speaking. We are here to listen. Consider the scale of these ancient empires. They raised walls of granite and iron that scraped the sky, convinced that their dominance was a law of nature. Emperors commissioned monuments to celebrate their own immortality, believing that stone could defy the passage of centuries. They walked through halls of polished gold, deaf to the tremors beneath their feet. But in the damp caves and the dusty corners of the marketplace, others were watching. These were the hermits and the outcasts, individuals who lived on the fringes of society. They did not care for the politics of the throne. Instead, they watched the flight of birds and the shifting of the stars. They saw the cracks in the foundation that the architects chose to ignore. When they spoke, their words were sharp, carrying the scent of smoke and the chill of coming winter. They warned of fire that would consume the libraries. The ruling elite laughed, dismissing these claims as the ramblings of the desperate. Yet, the seers were not deterred. They knew that empires do not fall in a day. They die in the slow, agonizing moments where arrogance blinds the powerful to their own end. We move now from the shadow of the ruins to the clarity of the archive. Our mission is to strip away the layers of myth that have accumulated around these figures. We are not merely cataloging the collapse. We are dissecting the mechanism of the warning itself. Who were these individuals who stood at the threshold of history? We will examine the records of the Sibyls in the Mediterranean and the court astrologers of the East, tracing the thin line they walked between the throne and the abyss. We must identify the symbols they left behind, the recurring motifs of the broken statue and the sky turned to blood, and determine if these were genuine insights, or the retrospective projections of a society already in decline. This inquiry demands a critical eye. We seek to understand the intersection of human anxiety and the inevitable decay of power. By analyzing the verses they whispered in the corridors of influence, we aim to uncover why their warnings resonate with such force in our own era. Are we looking at a map of the past, or are we staring into a mirror of our own uncertain future? The investigation begins here, in the cold, hard evidence of the written word, where the voices of the past wait to be tested against the reality of their claims. Before the foundations of Rome cracked or the walls of Constantinople fell, the atmosphere shifted. History often misleads us into believing that the end of an empire is a singular, violent event, a sudden collapse of masonry, or a swift defeat in the field. But the archives tell a different story. Collapse is rarely sudden. It is a slow, grinding erosion of certainty. It begins in the quiet moments of daily life. The merchant notices a slight hesitation in the market. The administrator finds a discrepancy in the ledger that no one can explain, and the citizen feels a subtle, unnameable tension in the air. This is the first stage of the end. It is a pervasive sense of unease that settles into the marrow of a civilization. People begin to look at their institutions, the laws, the currency, the borders, and find them thinner than they were the day before. The belief in the permanence of the state starts to fray. It is not yet panic, but it is the loss of the assumption that tomorrow will look exactly like today. This creeping doubt is the true precursor to ruin. As the collective confidence wanes, the silence of a city becomes heavy, burdened by the weight of what is being ignored. When the internal logic of a civilization begins to fail, the human mind instinctively turns its gaze outward, searching the horizon for a sign. In the ancient world, the sky was not merely a backdrop for existence. It was a complex, divine language waiting to be decoded. A comet streaking across the night was never just a celestial body of ice and dust. It was a burning signature of impending judgment. The flight of birds, their patterns, and their sudden erratic shifts were not simple biological behaviors. They were interpreted as a script written by the gods, a series of warnings etched into the atmosphere. This transition from observation to superstition is the hallmark of a society in distress. When the familiar structures of life lose their reliability, the mundane becomes ominous. A sudden storm is no longer weather, it is a rebuke. A drought is not a climate cycle. It is a divine withdrawal. This is the birth of a fearful, hyper-attentive reality, where every rustle of the wind and every movement of the stars is scrutinized for hidden intent. The people stopped seeing the world as it was and started seeing it as a message of their own demise. The fear of the heavens did not emerge in a vacuum. It was the direct consequence of a rot that began in the heart of the state. Within the marble halls of the Senate, the language of governance shifted from service to self-preservation. Bribes became the standard currency of policy, and the common good was traded for the security of the elite. As the treasury emptied, the tangible signs of decline became impossible to ignore. Public works projects stalled, the roads fell into disrepair, and the legions went unpaid, their loyalty flickering like a dying flame. The populace watched these failures unfold in the marketplace and the forum. They saw the grain supply dwindle and the coinage debase, realizing that the pillars of their world were hollow. This was the birth of a profound, collective anxiety. They turned their backs on the Senate floor and looked upward. They sought meaning in the chaos of the sky. When the institutions of power finally lost their grip on the public imagination, the stage was set for a new kind of authority. The people were no longer waiting for policy or decree. They were waiting for a voice that could name their terror. This is when the Seers arrived. They did not come with armies or tax collectors. They emerged from the margins, appearing in the marketplaces and at the gates of the capital, carrying the weight of the invisible. Their arrival was not a coincidence. It was a symptom of a society that had exhausted its own capacity for logic. Where the state failed to provide stability, the seer provided a narrative of inevitability. They walked through the crowded forums, their presence acting as a lightning rod for the collective dread that had been simmering in the shadows. They spoke of the end not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a cycle to be understood. This marked a profound shift in the social psyche. The populace stopped asking how to save their empire and started asking what the end would look like. The seer became the mirror of their insecurity, a figure who validated the fear that the foundations were already crumbling. Among these figures, none occupied a more precarious space than the Sibyls of the Mediterranean. They stood at the literal and figurative edge of the world, bridging the divide between the absolute authority of the throne and the encroaching darkness of the abyss. These were not merely observers. They were the conduits through which the anxiety of an empire was channeled. They resided in damp, echoing grottos or hidden shrines, far removed from the polished marble of the Senate. When a king sought their counsel, he had to leave the comfort of his palace and descend into their domain. This journey was a physical manifestation of the power dynamic shifting. The ruler, accustomed to command, suddenly found himself a supplicant in the presence of a voice that did not fear his legions. The Sibyls spoke in riddles, their words often echoing off the stone walls long after the king had departed. They were the unsettling reminder that even the most secure throne rested on a foundation of shifting sand. They were consulted not because they were loved, but because the weight of the unknown had become too heavy for the state to bear alone. By placing themselves in the gap between the living power of the empire and the silent inevitability of its end, they forced the rulers to confront the fragility of their own existence. In the courts of the East, the dynamic shifted from the grotto to the observatory. Here, the astrologers did not wait for supplicants. They were embedded in the very architecture of power. Every night, they climbed the stone stairs to the high platforms, their eyes fixed on the cold, indifferent movement of the constellations. When an emperor awoke from a dream of falling towers or eclipsed suns, he did not consult his generals. He summoned the astrologer. The ritual was precise. The astrologer would trace the path of a comet or the alignment of planets against the records of past dynasties, searching for a pattern. This was a fragile dependency. The emperor, holding absolute command over millions, became a child in the face of the celestial map. He needed the astrologer to translate the language of the heavens into a narrative of survival or doom. If the stars spoke of decline, the entire machinery of the state shuddered. The astrologers held the power to validate the emperor's fears or to dismiss them as mere shadows. They stood in the dim light of the star charts, their fingers deciding the fate of provinces. Their presence turned the throne room into a place of constant, quiet terror. Power, in its highest form, had become a slave to the unknown. These warnings did not remain confined to the high platforms of observatories or the isolation of grottos. They bled into the architecture of the state itself. Seers began to weave their prophecies into the very fabric of sacred texts, embedding cryptic verses between lines of established law and ritual. This was a calculated act of infiltration. A scribe, working by the flicker of a single lamp, would insert a warning about crumbling foundations into a document meant to glorify the king. These were not public declarations. They were whispers meant for those who knew how to listen. In the corridors of power, the atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of these hidden truths. Officials would pause in the dim light of stone hallways, exchanging glances as they passed scrolls containing these unsettling additions. The warnings became a form of intellectual conspiracy, a shadow language that permeated the daily business of governance. Every official decree, every tax record, and every treaty now carried the potential for a double meaning. The palace became a labyrinth of suspicion, where a single phrase in a sacred scroll could signal the end of a dynasty. It created a pervasive sense of dread that could not be purged. The truth was no longer spoken openly. It was hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the empire would finally falter, proving the validity of the whisper. The seer emerged from the shadows of the archives to become a living monument to the inevitable. They stood at the base of great marble pillars, watching the daily bustle of the marketplace with eyes that saw the cracks beneath the foundation. While citizens walked past, focused on the immediate weight of their trade, the seer remained motionless, a silent counterpoint to the arrogance of the era. This was their true function, to act as a witness to the fragility of human achievement. They did not build, they observed. They did not command, they cautioned. By their very presence, they stripped away the illusion of permanence that sustained the empire. A king might commission a statue to last 1,000 years, but the seer stood beside it, pointing to the moss already claiming the base. They forced the observer to look past the gilded surface and recognize the slow, grinding process of erosion. Every triumph of engineering was measured against the seer's quiet gaze. In the shadow of a rising arch, the seer was the reminder that all progress is merely a temporary stay against the silence. The transformation begins only when the smoke clears. Once the walls have fallen and the archives are scattered into ash, the survivors return to the fragments. They pick up the scrolls that were once dismissed as the ramblings of the fringe. A verse that spoke of dark skies is now held against the memory of a city choked by fire. The alchemy of memory is absolute. What was once a vague, poetic observation is now read as a precise, terrifying instruction manual for the disaster that just occurred. The survivors do not see coincidence. They see a map. They trace the lines of the text, matching every word to a specific ruin, a specific loss, a specific day of the collapse. This is the retrospective myth-making that seals the seer's legacy. The ambiguity of the original warning is stripped away, replaced by the crushing weight of hindsight. They convince themselves that the end was always written, always known, and always inevitable. It is a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos of their own survival. By framing the destruction as a prophecy, they turn a senseless tragedy into a story of fate. The seer is no longer a person. They are the voice of the future, looking back at the past. The warning is validated not by its accuracy, but by the survivors' need to believe that their world did not end by accident, but by design. The survivors move through the debris with a new, sharper vision. They no longer see the city as it was, but as a sequence of warnings they failed to heed. A cracked clay tablet, once discarded as a merchant's ledger, is now held up to the light. They trace the markings, finding a date that aligns perfectly with the first breach of the outer wall. The terror is not in the event itself, but in the sudden, cold clarity of the timeline. Every detail that seemed random before now locks into place like a gear in a machine. They recall the flight of birds over the Senate House, the way the water in the cistern turned stagnant weeks before the siege, and the strange, persistent silence of the marketplace. These were not accidents. They were signals. The survivors piece these fragments together, creating a narrative of inescapable fate. They stand in the center of the ruin and realize that the end was not a sudden strike, but a long, slow accumulation of signs that they were too arrogant to read. The air in the ruins feels heavy with this realization. They look at the horizon and see the same patterns repeating in the distance, knowing now that the path to the end is marked by the very things they chose to ignore. The past is no longer a memory. It is a blueprint for the next collapse. The human mind rejects the randomness of catastrophe. When the dust settles, the survivors begin the work of rewriting the timeline. They take the raw data of their trauma, the sudden fire, the collapsing bridge, the abandoned post, and map it against the ancient, cryptic verses. A simple shift in the wind, once ignored, is now recorded as the breath of a dying god. They do not merely remember the past, they curate it. They strike out entries in their logs that do not fit the narrative of doom and highlight the ones that do. This is the alchemy of memory. It converts the messy, chaotic reality of survival into a clean, logical progression toward an inevitable end. They hold their pens with shaking hands, documenting the omens as if they were historical facts. By the time the ink dries, the prophecy is no longer a suggestion. It is an ironclad record of a destiny that could not have been avoided. They convince themselves that the signs were always clear, always present, and always screaming for attention. The fear of the event becomes the fuel for the belief in the prophecy. They build a cage of logic around their own suffering, ensuring that every tragedy is anchored to a pre-existing warning. We face a final, uncomfortable question. Did the seer truly pierce the veil of time, or did the future simply project its own shape onto their words? Consider the mechanism of the oracle. A seer speaks into the dark. The empire falls. The survivors, desperate for order, rush to the archives to find a match. They scan the verses, discard the misses, and elevate the hits. It is a process of retrospective alignment. The seer provides the raw clay, and the catastrophe provides the mold. We must ask if the prophecy exists independently, or if it is merely a mirror held up to the wreckage. When we read these ancient warnings today, we are not deciphering the past. We are scanning for our own reflection. We look at the broken statues and the empty halls described in the texts, and we see our own institutions beginning to fray. The seer becomes a conduit for our own anxieties about the present. We do not study these texts to learn what happened to them. We study them to see if the end is already written into our own actions. The mystery is not in the seer's vision, but in our own relentless need to find our own termination date hidden in the verses of the past. The mirror is clear. We are the ones looking for the crack in the foundation. The imagery of collapse is not a matter of opinion. It is a recurring visual signature carved into the earth. We see it first in the broken statue. A marble head lies face down in the dirt, the nose chipped away, the once proud features smoothed by decades of neglect. This is the physical erasure of a name. Next, we enter the throne room. The air here is stagnant, trapped behind heavy doors that have not opened for centuries. Dust coats the dais where the ruler once sat. The chair is empty. There is no struggle, no final battle, just the absolute stillness of a space that has lost its purpose. The archives are left to rot, the parchment curling and turning to gray flakes in the damp. These are the markers of an empire in its final season. Whether it is the toppled columns of a distant desert city or the rusted locks on a fortress gate, the narrative remains consistent. The order that once governed the world dissolves into silence. These are not metaphors. They are the physical remnants of a system that failed to sustain itself. Every generation leaves these ruins behind as a warning. The throne is empty, and the statues are broken. This is the final, undeniable state of all human achievement. The physical ruins are only the beginning. Before the walls fall, the atmosphere itself undergoes a transformation. The light shifts. The horizon loses its depth, flattening into a bruised, oppressive haze. This is the visual signature of the final season. The air grows thick, tasting of copper and ozone, as if the atmosphere is reacting to the pressure of a dying system. Then, the change accelerates. The clouds do not just darken, they saturate. A deep, arterial red bleeds across the zenith, swallowing the sun. This is the sky of blood. It is a phenomenon that defies natural explanation, yet it appears in every record of total collapse. The color reflects off the stone, staining the white marble of the temples and the gray dust of the streets. It forces every eye upward. There is no escape from this light. It penetrates the inner chambers and illuminates the empty throne rooms with a violent, pulsating glow. When the heavens turn to blood, the empire is already gone. The silence that follows is the weight of an ending that has finally arrived. The pattern of collapse is not always a slow erosion. Sometimes it is a sudden, violent fracture. Look to the heart of the Aztec Empire. The great city of Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineered canals and stone causeways, a complex machine of trade and ritual. Then, the order shattered. The marketplace, once the pulse of the continent, emptied in minutes. Merchants abandoned their goods, leaving gold and feathers to scatter across the stone plazas. The priests stood on the steps of the Templo Mayor, their chants drowned out by the metallic clatter of incoming forces. The hierarchy that held this civilization together dissolved under the pressure of an external, unstoppable force. Rituals were abandoned mid-ceremony. The sacred fires were extinguished, not by choice, but by the chaos of the streets. People fled toward the lake, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The causeways, once the pride of their engineers, became bottlenecks of panic. There was no time for the slow decay of history here. The intricate web of alliances and obligations snapped, leaving only the raw, unfiltered reality of a city under siege. The transition happened in the span of a single, brutal season. Contrast this with the slow, agonizing decay of the Western Roman Empire. Here, the end did not arrive with a single, violent fracture. It was a long, rhythmic erosion of certainty. The borders, once held by disciplined legions, grew porous. Garrisons in the north stopped receiving pay, then stopped receiving orders. Soldiers walked away from their posts, leaving gates unbarred and watchtowers empty. Within the capital, the machinery of government began to stutter. The aqueducts, the lifeblood of the city, fell into disrepair. Roads cracked. Bridges collapsed under the weight of neglect. The Senate, once a body of decisive action, became a theater of empty rhetoric. Taxes went uncollected, and the grain supply became erratic, leading to bread riots that the city guards were too few to suppress. This was not a sudden fall, but a gradual withdrawal of authority. The empire retreated from its own extremities, pulling inward until the center itself became hollow. The decline was visible in the overgrown forums and the silent workshops. It was a process of forgetting how to function as a unified power. The final stage of any empire is the silence that follows the departure of the living. Look at the palaces that once commanded the world. The heavy oak doors hang off their hinges, swinging in the wind that now moves freely through the throne rooms. Tapestries, once vibrant with the symbols of dynastic power, have rotted into gray rags that cling to the cold stone walls. In the inner chambers, the archives have been left to the dust. Thousands of scrolls, once the record of laws, taxes, and decrees, lie scattered across the mosaic floors. The ink is fading, and the parchment is brittle, crumbling under the weight of undisturbed neglect. No one remains to read them. No one remains to enforce the orders they contain. The grand halls, once echoing with the footsteps of diplomats, now hold only the sound of shifting debris. The fountains in the courtyards have dried, their marble basins cracked by the frost. The gardens have surrendered to weeds, and the statues are toppled. The noise of power has been entirely replaced by the absolute, heavy silence of history. The transition is complete. The empire has become a tomb. Why does this ancient silence still haunt us? We live in an age of rapid technological acceleration, where global influence shifts with the speed of a fiber-optic pulse. Yet, the fear of decline remains as potent as it was in the shadow of the Roman Forum. Look at our own infrastructure. We rely on complex, interconnected systems that span the globe, yet we rarely consider their fragility. Just as the ancient aqueducts required constant maintenance to sustain the city, our digital networks and power grids demand a level of vigilance we often take for granted. We see the patterns of the past reflected in our own institutions. When a system becomes too vast to manage, or when the cost of maintaining order exceeds the resources available, the cracks begin to show. We are not just observing the fall of distant empires. We are recognizing the same symptoms of instability in our own backyard. The archives of the past are not merely dusty relics. They are a mirror. They reflect our own insecurity about the stability of the world we have built. We look at the complexity of our modern life and wonder if we are standing at the edge of a similar threshold, searching for a map to navigate a future that feels increasingly unpredictable. Consider the institutions that define your daily life. The banks, the courts, the massive administrative bodies that manage the flow of resources. We treat these structures as permanent, yet they are built on the same shifting sands that once supported the Roman Senate. Look closely at the cracks. When public infrastructure begins to fail, when the cost of maintaining the status quo outweighs the benefits, and when the people lose faith in the mechanisms of governance, the end is already in motion. We watch the news and see the same patterns of decay, the budget deficits, the gridlocked legislatures, and the slow erosion of public trust. It is easy to dismiss these as temporary setbacks, but history suggests otherwise. We are forced to ask the uncomfortable question: are we living in the final chapter of our own grand narrative? The institutions we rely on are not immune to the laws of entropy. They are fragile, dependent on a consensus that is rapidly fracturing. Every time we walk through a crumbling transit station or read about the collapse of a long-standing trade agreement, we are witnessing the same symptoms that preceded the fall of every great power. We are not just observers of history. We are participants in a cycle that is reaching its inevitable conclusion. The silence that once claimed the palaces of the past is beginning to echo in the halls of our own civilization. Why do we keep returning to these ancient verses? It is a desperate act of navigation. When the present becomes too volatile to read, we reach into the archives, treating the warnings of long-dead seers as if they were maps for our own survival. We pore over the cryptic lines of the sibyls and the court astrologers, searching for a pattern that might explain the chaos of our own era. It is a strange, modern alchemy. We take the fragmented, poetic observations of a crumbling past and attempt to overlay them onto our own complex reality. We want to believe that if we can decode the omen, we can avoid the ruin. We scour the pages for a sign, a hint, or a sequence of events that mirrors our own path, hoping to find a way to stabilize the ground beneath our feet. This is not about faith. It is about the raw, human need for a predictable outcome. We are grasping at the shadows of empires, trying to find a foothold in the verses of the past to steady ourselves against the uncertainty of the future. We treat these old warnings as technical manuals, dissecting every word for a clue that might grant us the foresight to survive the coming shift. Now, we must step back and look at these archives with a colder, more clinical eye. Historians remain locked in a fundamental debate. Was there ever a true vision, or are we merely witnessing the masterwork of retrospective myth-making? Consider the timeline. Many of these accounts were penned decades, sometimes centuries, after the cities they describe had already become ruins. It is the alchemy of trauma. When a civilization collapses, the survivors are left in a landscape of jagged stone and silence. They reach back into the past, pulling out vague verses and half-remembered omens, then sharpening them into precise predictions. A mention of dark skies becomes the smoke of a specific burning gate. A warning of famine becomes a detailed account of a failed harvest. The prophecy is not a window into the future. It is a mirror reflecting the agony of the present. We cannot prove the supernatural, and we cannot verify the seer's sight. What we can prove is the human necessity to create a narrative out of wreckage. We are not uncovering hidden truths. We are observing the way a people, broken by the loss of their world, rewrite their own history to make sense of the void. We must strip away the debate over foresight and myth. The supernatural becomes irrelevant when we confront the raw, enduring power of the belief itself. Whether the seer truly glimpsed the future or merely articulated the collective anxiety of their time, the result remains identical. The warning survived. It traveled through centuries, jumping from one crumbling empire to the next, gaining strength with every retelling. This is the true mechanism of the prophecy. It is not a test of magic, but a test of human resonance. When a warning persists across thousands of years, it becomes a structural element of our civilization. It functions as a persistent alarm. We find that the accuracy of the omen matters far less than its capacity to haunt us. The fact that we are still analyzing these ancient words is the only proof required. The warning has outlived the walls, the legions, and the very empires that feared it. It is the most resilient artifact we possess. The prophecy is not a message from the future. It is a permanent, living scar on the collective consciousness of humanity. If the warning was never meant to be a shield, then what was its true design? We must reconsider the figure of the seer. They stood at the gates of falling cities, whispering of ruin, yet the stones still crumbled. They were not architects of salvation. They were not sent to halt the inevitable march of time or to preserve the throne. Their presence was a different kind of service. They were the ones tasked with the burden of naming the end before it arrived. By speaking the truth of impermanence, they stripped the illusion of eternity. They forced a confrontation with reality. This was not a call to arms, but a call to awareness. In their cryptic verses, we find a strange, somber peace. It is the realization that no power, no matter how vast or golden, was ever intended to last forever. The seer did not come to stop the fall. They came to ensure that when the end finally arrived, it would not be a surprise. They taught us to look at the cracks in the foundation, not with terror, but with the understanding that every beginning carries the seed of its own conclusion. The empires fall, and in that surrender, we find the quiet clarity. The empires fall, and the dust settles. It is a quiet, heavy settling coating the broken marble, and the abandoned archives in a fine gray veil. This is the final act of the grand narrative. The noise of the marketplace, the commands of the generals, and the prayers of the desperate all fade into the same stillness. Yet, this silence is not an absence. It is a repository. As the debris of one civilization becomes the foundation for the next, the voices of the past continue to whisper from beneath the layers of time. They are the persistent hum of human experience, reminding us that history is not a straight line, but a circle. Each collapse is merely a transition, a shedding of old skin to make room for the new. The cycle repeats with a mechanical, brutal precision. We see the patterns emerge in the ruins. The same arrogance, the same warnings, and the same inevitable dissolution. The dust that buries the past is the same dust that will eventually settle upon our own achievements. We stand now at the threshold. It is a precarious edge, one that every generation before us has occupied, believing their own time to be the center of the world. Look around. The institutions we trust, the borders we draw, and the progress we celebrate, they are all anchored in the same soil that once held the ruins of empires long forgotten. We are not merely observers of this archive. We are its current chapter. The seers of old were not speaking to the dead. They were speaking to us. They were warning that the stability we feel is a fragile construction, held together by the collective belief that tomorrow will look like today. But history is a relentless tide. It does not pause for our ambitions, nor does it wait for our permission to turn the page. As the echoes of the past fade into the background, we are left with the quiet, unsettling weight of our own agency. We are the ones who must decide how to carry the warnings of those who came before. We are the ones who must navigate the uncertainty of our own horizon. The cycle does not end with the fall. It begins anew, with the realization that we are here, in this moment, standing exactly where they stood. The threshold is not a place in the past. It is the ground beneath our feet, and the wind is already beginning to change.